Greetings, fellow explorers in the furthest regions of experience. Welcome back to the lab. My name is John. Games Workshop has recently promoted the Emperor's Children to being their own standalone army. I say recently because as of right now, the codex and the box have not been released yet, and I wanted this video to kind of be somewhere near its release, so I hope I'm somewhat close, or a little early, a little before, you know. As Slaaneshi Marines, the Emperor's Children are known for their garish and vibrant power armor markings. However, if you look online, a lot of people tend to keep them on the simple side, which is, like, I know, you know, army painting, feasibility and stuff, but like, that's kind of like the exact opposite of what this faction is, if you think about it, you know? So, seeing as a lot of people will be starting Emperor's Children armies or warbands very soon, I thought I'd put out a very basic tutorial on how to do some beginner level patterns that you can use to spice up your own army. Now, for context, I am not a professional painter. I'm pretty much self-taught entirely, being shown the ropes by my friend Nathan very long ago, and further being forged in the fires of Mini Wargamer J's tutorials, and of course the patron saint Duncan, blessed be his name. I like to think in general I'm like a solid mid-tier painter, low mid-tier, you know. If you put me in a tier list, I'd probably be like comfortable upper C tier, maybe bottom of B tier, depending on matchups and frame data, you know. However, I am 100% convinced that there are very simple ways that any random dickhead out there can spice up a Slaaneshi army. And by Slaaneshi army, you know, Emperor's Children, one of their splinter warbands, maybe, you know, something in Age of Sigmar. I don't actually know what they do over there in Age of Sigmar land. I'm just kind of assuming. We don't really talk much. You don't need a lot of skill to do any of these patterns. You don't need fancy brushes, airbrushes. You don't need to do some super in-depth fancy tech. You don't need to be a painting god. This is practical advice for beginners, the honest blue-collar wargamer. Each design I'm covering today is both relevant to Slaaneshi's aesthetic and relatively quick to do. I promise you, even if you think you cannot do freehanding, you can do this. Just like G.I. Joe, confidence is half the battle, and the other half is definitely extreme violence. First, we'll start off with the pattern I'm most often asked how to do, and then we'll move from there. But first, let's talk brushes. Also, I was going to wear my leopard print blanket like over my shoulders, but it's really fucking hot in here. These lights are a nightmare. I do 90% of my painting on this entire channel with these brushes here, dry brushes not shown. The yellow one is some random piece of shit from a $5 variety pack from Hobby Lobby, and it's had its tip cut off from a superglue accident. I use it for hitting big base coats, and it's pretty much Old Faithful here in the lab. The middle one is an old size 0 brush that is hooking hardcore, still useful for tight base coat areas and edge highlights, but also useful for designs like spots since there's basically no tip to destroy anymore. The last one is the only one I'm a little bit protective over, a size 0 with a good point. We'll also be sponging a little bit today, and I use a bit of pluck foam for this, usually found in customizable carrying cases. None of these brushes cost more than $10 by themselves, and 2 are admittedly pretty trashy brushes. So it should make a point that you don't need fancy brushes to do anything here today. Before painting anything today, I painted the major areas of the armor with a quick dry brush with some touch-ups. In this case, it's Vallejo Neutral Gray on a black base coat. No washes yet, as I like to do my wash step near the end, but wherever you do it is up to you. My logic is that the quicker you fuck up the freehanding, the easier and quicker it is to fix. I'd rather repaint something 30 minutes into working on it rather than 2 hours. Bottom line is, just paint the armor how you would like it before you start with the freehands. You know your process better than I do. Just get to the point where you say, hey, I'm ready to do freehands. This is a Mark 6 Marine from the new Horus Heresy line, but these techniques also apply to 40K's more trim-tastic Space Marines just fine. Just paint the design, then paint the trim in the desired color. It's not rocket science. The first design we're going to be covering today is probably the reason why you clicked on the video, which is the Leopard print. analogous to the forces of Slaaneshi for decades. As leopards and cheetahs are both similar to pattern and varied in print color, there are a lot of ways to approach this with a lot of leniency for variation. I'll be keeping with a tan color for my demonstration here. There are basically two ways to do this design, but both rely on a simple color triad. Basically just think color, dark color, and light color. In my case, my triad will be a dark brown, a brown, and tan. To start off, we'll be sponging the main tan color on, so we need to start with a dark brown base coat. Sponging lends the pattern more of an interesting texture that sort of mimics the consistency of fur, although if you want a more solid panel and you don't want the texture, feel free to skip this step and just paint on your midtone. Next, I'll be sponging on my lighter tone, in this case, tan. When you sponge paint on like this, you need to make sure your paint is a little watered down more than normal, which will help prevent too much of a physical texture from building up on your model. I mean, you'll get a little, but it won't be like, noticeable. When I sponge armor, I like to use some tweezers to hold the sponge so my hand doesn't cramp, and I find it's a little more maneuverable in general. As you're sponging the mini, you want a nice variation to be built up slowly as you do. If you begin to get a small consistent blotch like I did here, it just means that there is a pocket of paint within the sponge that wasn't worked out properly before you started stabbing. You can usually fix this by just working your sponge over it more and kind of blending it in. Or you could even repaint the area entirely with your base coat, but I usually just sponge over it. I ain't got time to be picky. I got a schedule these days. In general, work slowly so you can stop quickly if you can see the paint going on a little thicker than you'd like. But the best way to avoid this problem entirely is to stab the sponge on a test surface. In this case, I like to use my thumb. Then sponging it over with less paint and a lighter touch. It is a lot easier to apply more paint than take paint off. When this is done, it should leave you with a nice mottled surface that mimics the visual texture of fur. Maybe it doesn't, maybe it does, but it's a little more interesting than a solid block of color, to me at least, but your preferences may vary. And very quickly, since my test marine here is only using half a panel of leopard print, I take a second now to clean up my base coat and neaten the border of the design. Now we'll move on to the spots, which can fall into two variants, colored spots and black spots. We'll touch on black spots later since they're a little more straightforward. This color here is going to be the middle color between your base coat of brown and the highlight of tan. The easiest way I find to do it is to just mix the colors 1-to-1 because you've got both colors on your palette anyways, but if you're using any color triad, just use the middle option. If you base coated a dark blue, sponged on a light blue, use your medium blue for the spots. When painting on these spots, you'll want to thin your paint so it flows off your brush, but not run away from you. In other words, thin enough to go on smoothly, but you can still keep control of it. When it comes to actually painting those spots, I found the easiest method personally is to pull up a picture of leopard print or cheetah print and just find little blobs in the design that catch your eye and emulate those blobs to a loose degree on your mini, leaving a space between the blobs roughly the width of the hairs of your brush. The spots I normally paint are usually about 1 millimeter in diameter, obviously varying because they all look like chicken nuggets. But I find that this size makes the pattern discernible from 2 feet away, which is the primary distance you'll be looking at the mini 90% of the time anyways. When your spots are on, we need to outline those spots. This could be considered the only hard part of doing this design, but it's only as difficult as you make it. For this step, grab your sharpest brush and water down some black paint a little more than normal. Just like earlier, you want the paint to freely flow off the tip, but not be runny. Brace yourself in a steady position, usually both elbows on the table and your hands together, and begin to draw very thin, squiggly lines around each of the chicken nuggets you just painted. I find these spots look a little better having a break or two in the black outlines, similar to the real patterns. And there you go. That's pretty much the hard part done. Were you expecting more? No. No, it's really that simple. All you need is a steady hand, practice, and some confidence. Work slowly in steps and keep the paint thin so it doesn't get chunky. I mentioned earlier that you could also do this pattern with black spots, and it really is as easy as it sounds, even easier than the previous design. This could be a nice option if you don't quite feel ready to outline colored spots for that level of accuracy, but there are certain advantages this method has regardless of skill level and hand steadiness. The basic concept is as straightforward as it sounds, simply using black to draw your chicken nuggets instead. With pure black patterns, I find that the occasional small dot of black can help add a bit of variation across the pattern and fill in small gaps for areas you might have missed. This is something that the colored pattern can't do very well, so I think that is an advantage for this simpler design. Pure black spots can also play very well with transparent contrast paints, glazes, and inks. The transparent property of the paint doesn't shift the black paint at all. So if you, for example, you start with a pure white undercoat from a spray primer, you can paint the black spots on before using contrast or speed paints on your model. For those looking to speed paint or batch paint an entire army, this could save you an immense amount of time down the road, while also giving your army a bit of that Slaaneshi flavor, the drip as the Zoomers say. And it really doesn't take that long to do. Like, to do a leg panel would maybe be 30 seconds, a pauldron, 30 seconds. Like, the time investment compared to the payoff is, in my opinion, pretty damn huge. There's a lot of versatility in the techniques behind this pattern, and there's no real wrong answers considering the natural variation of the source pattern, so figure out which technique you like more or which one better suits your needs, and give it a go. I promise you, this is something you can do. Since I personally like to do my washes as one of the last steps, I apply 1 part Army Painter Brown, Army Painter Black, and 2 parts Glaze Medium. This is known as marine juice, and it's a popular wash for its universal nature that doesn't tint base coats very much. While I normally hit the whole model with this at the end, I'm just going to do this little section here. While marine juice doesn't tint base coats too much, it will darken the model ever so slightly due to the nature of, still being a wash. So after it dries, it's the perfect opportunity to take your highlight color and edge highlight the armor wherever needed. I'll be using marine juice going forward, so keep this in mind. The next pattern we're going to be covering is going to be stripes, in particular, zebra stripes. This is probably the simplest pattern we'll be covering today, and in retrospect I probably should have covered it first, but whatever. I'm going to be using 3 colors for my design, my base coat being a mix of sky gray and pure white. Painting pure white over black usually takes forever, and it ends up looking like chunky dog shit anyways. Vallejo Scried Gray. Hell, I'd watch that. Vallejo Sky Gray in this case is mixed in both because I find that it covers very, very well. And we don't actually want to have a white base coat anyways. If you paint with pure white, you leave yourself no options for highlighting down the line. So in this case, an off-white gives us highlighting options and makes covering over the black not complete cock and ball torture. Although, given who's probably watching this video, anyways, with your base coat on, whatever color you choose to do so, we're now ready to do the stripes. So get your sharp brush and load it up with a thin down black paint. Grab a picture of zebra stripes off the internet, and much in the same way as the leopard print, try to find some stripes that you can emulate on your model. The best way to think of painting each stripe is that each one is a combination of 2 brush strokes coming together to make a single line. Use the first line to establish the general direction of the stripe, then the second line to build in the variations of the stripe's width. You can also opt to hold your brush at an angle and apply different levels of force to the surface, getting thicker portions where you press harder. While this method does look good in its own way, this is a little less controllable, especially on curved surfaces, so I find the 2-line per stripe method a little more reliable and a little more consistent, especially in tight areas. When painting stripes on a surface, much like this marine's thigh, keep the pattern going in the same direction across the entire shape's volume. Think of it like wrapping paper. You have the pattern, so apply that to a 3D shape, whatever it may be. As with the leopard print, I'll apply my wash afterwards to emulate how I would normally do it in the painting process. Just keep an eye on this as it dries, You really don't want your wash to pool and dry, which will obscure your freehand. It looks like shit anyway, so just don't do it in general. Don't let your paint pool like that. When the wash dries, edge highlight any applicable areas. In the case of me using off-white as my base coat, I can now use pure white on the edges to make the edges really pop. Zebra Stripe is a very simple design and uses colors frankly any mini painter should have within their arsenal, although you can obviously change the color of the white to any color that you'd like. For example, my Chaos Sorcerer uses orange for a tiger stripe inner cape. However, since this is a black and white pattern, the zebra striping also plays well with contrasts and inks like we talked about earlier. Start with a white marine ready for speed paints, paint on the stripes, then you can tint this area to whatever vibrant eye-destroying contrast color you'd like. If you speed painted most of your model black and pink, having one extra area to paint, orange or blue or red or something really doesn't take that long. You could have a pretty snazzy army very quickly. The next pattern we're going to be covering is two types of flames. A simple decorative kind and a more detailed glowing like proper flame you'd see on like salamanders minis. Now we need a pinky purple paint, and obviously most of you will have bought the paint you'd like to use for your army, but I actually don't have any pink paint. So I'll be using a mix of magenta and white paint in a 1-to-1 mixture going forward, but obviously feel free to swap this color for whatever color you want. On one set of flames, this pink will be the base coat, and on the other, it'll be the color of the actual flame, just to show you both of the options. Flame tendrils are best painted in the same way zebra stripes are, in the sense that each one is assembled from 2 lines. You start with a very light touch at the top of the flame, which helps ensure that you don't get a nasty little bulb at the top. From there you can drag your paintbrush down and begin filling out the wavy body, painting the outline and then filling in the outline afterwards. If you mess up on the outline, like I totally did on purpose right here, you can instead carve the flame out using your base coat, then keep going back and forth until you get a flame that looks good. Regardless, just make sure you keep your paints thin and don't mess with them too much as they're drying. If you begin to work the paint while that layer of paint has not completely dried, you may shift the base coat and damage it, leaving a nasty chunky base coat, a problem that's only going to get worse as more paint layers go on. Now for our glowing fire, we're going to mix even more white into our magenta. If you look at a normal fire, say on the aforementioned Salamander's model, if the previous base coat was the red step, this would be the layer of orange, in a sense. Fill the flame in, being sure to leave a discernible band of the previous base coat around it. We don't want to cover up the layer we just did, otherwise why the hell did we paint it? We move on to the next layer of the highlight, which would be painted yellow in a normal fire. For this I actually use a dot of white and add the smallest paintbrush dot's worth of magenta to it. If you're mixing paint like I am, it is usually more economical to add darker colors to lighter ones since it uses less paint. Anybody who has tried to mix orange paint by dumping 9 metric tons of yellow into red knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's way easier to just add the red to the yellow. As the previous step, you again fill in the flames, leaving a band of the second color visible. And for the final color, we're going to use pure white, both to fill the flame and to edge highlight the bottom of the leg. Like with every other pattern here, a simple black outline is entirely doable and brings its own benefits to the table, just like the black spots, just like the black stripes. Use whichever flame pattern you like more, but for this more realistic fire pattern we have here, simply assembling a set of 4 colors to build into a flame is quite simple. You could easily just do this with blue flames, green flames. You could even do multi-layered flames like I did with my old Apocalypse Company mini. There are a lot of possibilities, so don't be afraid to experiment. Speaking of experimentation, we're going to get into 2 patterns that I had no clue if they would even look good or not. I just wanted to try them. As I was scrolling through Instagram one day for inspiration for this video, I stumbled into this custom sculpt of Lucius by Siege Studios. Each face on this armor was sculpted onto the armor which gives it a lovely variation across the surface. As my longtime viewers know, I'm certainly up to the challenge, as I've done extensive resculpts before, but sculpting something like this takes a lot of time, and frankly it's something you would probably only do for like an HQ unit, but the biggest factor is I just didn't fucking feel like it. But out of sheer curiosity, I thought to myself, could I emulate this pattern solely through paint? Maybe not for a bunch of units, but like, like a squad lead, or, HQ unit, There's only one way to find out, so let me give it a try. We'll start with a pallid flesh tone, or in this case, tan, since I really don't have anything better for skin. Keep the paint thin and try to paint from one side to the other. If you hit the middle of a surface and paint from one side to the other side may partially dry if you take too long, and it will cause a small tide mark from the paint buildup. It's easier to just get into the habit of painting from one side to the other, so you remove the possibility of that happening entirely. With a solid base coat, we're going to hit the surface with a wash, a 1-to-1 mix of Caribou Crimson and some glazed medium. This is applied uniformly across the surface, and again, don't hit it too heavy and watch for pooling. We end up with a semi-bruised, fleshy base coat that I feel like would pretty much just work really well for flayed skin anyways, like just with like a little, like go back to the tan for some highlights or dry brush highlights, whatever. But we're not here for flayed skin, we're here for screaming faces. Looking at the original image, I realized that every face was essentially shaped anywhere from a smushed piece of bread to a bunch of dicks, which is pretty appropriate for this faction, or just generally what's going on right now. Keep all of your smushed bread in the same orientation you want the faces, so somewhat vertical if you're emulating the source picture, or whichever if you want them to be willy-nilly. With your wangs in place, grab your sharpest brush and paint the faces with a brown. You'll want 2 eyes, 2 small dots for the nose, and an open mouth. With, they don't have to be perfect, they're like warped, screaming faces. I just kind of scribbled the mouth in, and I thought it looked fine. This dark brown I used looked a little too stark to me, and I wasn't sure if it was just me, so for the back half of the pauldron, I ended up mixing the tan and the brown together, which made it a little softer. I'm not really sure which one looks better, but you've got 2 options here. You pick the one you like. I also feel like the pattern could have maybe benefited from less space between the faces, packing them a little tighter. But seeing as this was my first attempt ever, I think it looks pretty okay. I had these little squares of styrene that I was kind of like practicing on as I went. I didn't do one for this, so this is me just just raw dogging it really. Now obviously it's not the same as having an actual sculpted texture, but 1 or 2 of these in a crowd would definitely stand out in my opinion. At the very least, I've confirmed that tan with a little bit of Caribou Crimson on it makes for good flayed flesh, so even if it looks like shit, I still came out kind of knowing something. And finally, the last random design experiment. I made a community post asking for some suggestions on what kind of patterns that people would like to see me try out. And one of my longtime watchers suggested an oil spill, trancy style of pattern. I admit, I didn't know what the fuck I was doing here, like at all. I started with a dark purple base coat to differentiate the area from the surrounding black a tiny bit. I then watered each of my paints down to prep for drawing streaks across the pauldron. I used these colors to draw a combination of streaky and squiggly lines across the pauldron in various colors, with my only rule being to minimize how often one color bumps up next to itself. I even tried to glaze these colors, but I found out that I was working too fast and my glazes were running together and producing a muddy brown. This feels like something you would have to do really slowly and not in an improvised, artsy kind of fashion, but at least the muddy, blended together color could be soaked up with a wet brush. I feel like speed paints would be a nice thing to glaze over this pattern, but as I didn't have matching speed paints and this is supposed to be a small, quick video, I did what I could with, some minimal glazing, minimal prep, minimal knowing what the fuck I'm doing. While I was more than happy to accommodate a request, I know I completely flubbed it because I I'm not super crazy about it. I do know how I would improve on it though. I think I would try the speed paints for easy glazing. I noticed in a lot of my reference material, orange was a heavy color that showed up that I didn't really utilize a lot. And I would also use a gloss varnish to add a little bit of the shininess. But maybe I'm being a bit too harsh on myself. Maybe somebody actually likes it. Regardless, you know how I approached it. Maybe someone can learn from my mistakes and make some like trippy LSD Marines. And personally, it feels a little weird to half-ass a requested pattern, but I'm speaking directly to you, dude. I have no idea what the fuck I'm doing. I gave it a solid try. I'm sorry, man. So there we go. Some pretty simple techniques for spicing up anybody's Emperor Children's army, or, you know, Slaaneshi. Hopefully all of the new Emperor's Children collectors out there can glean some sort of wisdom from this video. Whether it's a semi-in-depth method for painting leopard print, to incorporating very simple stripes and flame patterns to spice up an army-wide project. Okay, yeah, I can't do this. Can't do it. I'm starting to sweat. If this video helped you in any way, shape, or form, or you might know somebody who may benefit from watching it, I would really appreciate it if you shared the video with them. I'm really hoping to hit 20,000 subs this year so we can do some fun events like Your Dudes, where I do my interpretation of my subscribers' armies. I don't claim to be, nor have ever claimed to be, a professional painter, but I do enjoy sculpting, converting, and painting interesting and obscure 40k factions, especially Space Marines and Chaos Space Marines. In fact, I have a whole series where I dive into very obscure factions within 40k. Some of them consisting of like a single sentence, maybe even down to just the name. I also cover a lot of non-40k content like Mordheim and Trench Crusade, even Gunpla, although it's been a little while, so maybe don't count that one. So if you like watching some laid-back, mid-wit, you know, crack some jokes and drone on for hours and hours, please check out my other videos. They are of dubious quality and minimal entertainment, but I'm a great second monitor kind of guy, so I'd be honored if you perused the catalog. Thank you for watching. Glory to the Prince of Pleasure, and have a good one.